Good morning and welcome to the Daily Ding here on the Athletic NBA Show. I'm Jared Weiss. I am joined by the Athletics Wolves writer John Krasinski. We have Andrew Schlecht producing the show. And John, it's perfect time to talk to you because Ant is the talk of the basketball world right now. He's been incredible for Team USA. He's kind of emerging as a face for the national team and obviously pretty soon a face of the NBA.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, Jared, because they got to Vegas to start working out with Team USA, and it looked like in the early going that there were kind of four starters set, and Anthony Edwards wasn't one of them. And when we heard sort of some of that analysis coming out very, very early in this whole situation back here in Minnesota, where Ant is loved like very few other Timberwolves have ever been. There was a bit of a mini riot here. Like, how could they not recognize that Ant is the man? And I think it hasn't taken very long for him to really assert himself as the go-to guy on Team USA. And that's what a lot of people here expected kind of from a fan base, but certainly I think even within the organization, they knew that once the teammates were around him, once his personality started to shine through, and then once he got on the court and started doing his thing, that people would fall in line behind him. And that sure seems like what's happening right now, on the eve of the World Cup. This is Ant's team, and that's kind of what everyone around here expected to happen.
You had this great story coming out of Vegas where we're all there. We're trying to find something interesting. And Ant gets his deal while he's out there, fortifying him as the face of the franchise, something that I assume is a little bit contentious, or at least a little bit. There's a lot to discuss there. But tell us more about the story that you put together, and I guess just the whole experience of watching Ant ascend, both within the organization and the basketball world in general.
Yeah, Jared. So he signs his max contract extension in July, when he was eligible for coming off of that rookie deal. And if he makes all NBA coming up, it'd be a $260 million contract, which would be the biggest in Timberwolves history. All of these things that are kind of falling into place for Anthony Edwards coming off of a very good third season, especially given his performance in the playoffs, both against Memphis a year ago and then against Denver this last spring. Anthony Edwards really played well, and so he gets this contract extension, and they had a press conference to unveil it in Las Vegas at Summer League, where he kind of started to share some of his thoughts and reflections on how far he's come and what has, kind of what he's thinking about as he gets ready to go into the next phase of his career. And the first thing that he mentioned was that, he had to thank his older brother, Bubba, who is always around him in Minnesota, just part of a very tight circle that he has surrounded himself with, of people who support him. And he said that, the reason that he started playing basketball was because his brother did it. Ant was a big football player when he was young and in youth football, and that was his favorite sport. It's what he loved to do. It's what he was really good at. But he saw how much love his brother had for the game and wanted to be like Big Brother. And so he's telling this story, and I look over and I see Bubba sitting kind of off to the side watching it all happen. And so naturally, after the press conference was over, I just went over and talked to Bubba for a little while and had him reflect a little bit on it. And he was very open and honest just about what it was like to watch his little brother not only ascend to where he has been ascending as a player, but to see the organization throw everything they have behind him. And then also just to hear, Anthony really kind of just illustrate to the world who was listening just what an impact that Bubba had on him. And so kind of really tried to dive into that dynamic and how important that family element is for Anthony, who, Anthony and Bubba lost their grandmother and their mother when Anthony was 14 years old. And so they've kind of been, leaning on each other through this whole thing. And so it was really kind of a touching tale that's kind of spun out of the commerce and the cold business of the NBA.
it's funny because there's this quote in here from Chris Finch who says, "Money often makes you a more exaggerated version of who you really are. He's genuine and he's real." And it was funny you mentioned the football thing because I remember that quote before the draft where people are starting to question, is this guy somebody want to build around? Where he's like, what was the quote exactly? I can't remember exactly what it was.
It was basically, it was less an exact quote, but more, yeah. He said in a story with ESPN that football was his sport. He loved football. And the whole story was basically constructed around the interaction that the reporter had with Ant on one or two occasions, and there was real sort of concern about, hey, is this guy really in it? Does he love the game? Does he want to be great at basketball? And is there enough desire there to merit a number one overall pick? And one thing about that I've learned about being around Anthony for the last 3 years is there are days where he's just not super engaged in the media side of things. It's not that big of a deal to him. He kind of wants to get in and get out of things. And when that happens, it can come off sometimes like he's just, not interested in the game, or he doesn't want to kind of really dive into breaking down things and all of that. And I think that there was just one of those days for him with that reporter who asked him, and he's like, I like football, I don't watch too much basketball. I don't do all, and that sent off a lot of red flags for the reporter and certainly anyone who read that story. But the more that you're around Ant, it was quickly apparent when he arrived in Minnesota as a rookie that this was not a situation of a young player who didn't really like the game. He's just an athlete. Like he's an ultra competitive. He really likes it. He really pours, everything that he has into it, and he wants to be great. And so, but yes, that story right before the draft and that interaction and those comments definitely did have a lot of people concerned about, were they getting Andrew Wiggins 2.0, something like that. And so that would lower the ceiling on Ant. And it turns out it couldn't be further from the truth.
I also think there's a misconception about the fact that these guys watch so much tape as part of their prep work that a lot of people want to take a break to have some sort of balance. Like they don't need to watch the game that's on that night for fun when they've already just spent like 2 hours watching basketball earlier in the day anyway. So like I get that. Like when I'm on my leisure time, I'm watching more soccer or F1 or golf or tennis or something like that than basketball because I already watch basketball like 4 or 5 hours a day for a living anyway. So I think that
Yeah,
probably got spun a little out of control.
for
But
sure. And I do think, like, I think Ant watches games too. I mean, but like I just think that day he just didn't want to talk about it. And at the time he was 18 years old, 19 years old, and still very new in the media game and the interactions and what your words can be construed as. And so it just kind of was maybe a learning lesson for him through that. But it was just a young kid who just had one of those days like, I'm not really into this, and I'm not going to give you a whole lot to work with.
well, it's funny because this goes back to that quote from Finch saying he's genuine and he's real is
Mhm.
something that I don't know if the public will notice as much, but we notice it because we're in these press conferences and scrums all the time. Is a big part of being a professional athlete is saying the same thing over and over and finding ways to answer questions without answering questions. And it's a reason why a lot of rookies come into the league and they're pretty quiet because it's overwhelming for one to do a press conference where you're speaking live and you can say one thing in the moment and that's going to live on forever and the whole world's going to see it, and whatever context or correction you want to apply, it's not going to matter. So it's a ton of pressure. It takes a while to be ready to handle that kind of pressure. And so seeing Ant go from where he started to now like clearly being a bona fide elite prospect going to be the face of the sport for a long time, and him having this press conference moment, you putting the story together, what I guess how smooth was the maturation process, and where do you think he is on that trajectory now?
Yeah, it was, remember, like, as a rookie, he came in the pandemic year. And so all of our interactions with him were via Zoom. And so there was very little sort of one-on-one, whether or just even in group settings in a locker room, after a practice with reporters in front of him. It was all kind of under with the veil of a screen between us. But I do think that one of the things that you did see early on was that, in terms of building off what Chris Finch said about his genuineness, is that uh, he was very endearing early, because whatever was in his head came out of his mouth. And like, you knew that what he was answering, the questions that he was answering, is exactly what he thought in that moment. And he was very charming, and he was very charismatic, and he did a really good job of just letting his personality flow through, even in those impersonal interactions that we all had during that season. You still could see the layers of Anthony Edwards, which was really encouraging. But then, as he's gotten more comfortable and has even a greater understanding of how the machine works, like, there are days where he knows what questions are going to be asked. He knows how to sort of sidestep the landmines that are coming, and he also knows how to speak up for mostly other teammates. He is kind of really, over the last year or so, when he's at his best with interviews, is when he is talking about teammates. He doesn't really like answering questions about himself a lot. He will engage on that front sometimes, but if you really want the light to come on with him, it's really when he gets a chance to speak about what Jaden McDaniels is doing, what Karl Anthony Towns is doing, Rudy Gobert, all these things, and trying to, he understands that people look to him and that he has a lot of credibility in the public sphere. And so he believes that if he speaks up for his teammates, that will help them in the public eye. And I think he's really savvy with that, and he understands it a lot more. And so he's more aggressive in doing that, which I think is pretty good for his role as an emerging leader on this team.
All right, let's talk about, maybe, I know Anthony Edwards wanted to play football, but there was a very important tackle that happened on the court this year with the Minnesota Timberwolves. Can you walk us through the story of Pierre Felix?
Yeah, so right around January, we dropped a story about Pierre Felix, who is a security guard for the Minnesota Timberwolves, and for a long, long time had been a security guard at Target Center before he was hired to kind of be the more on the Timberwolves staff. And during the playoffs against the Memphis Grizzlies a year ago, he got a little bit of a time to shine when a protester tried to get out onto the court during a game between the Grizzlies and the Wolves, and tried to protest the treatment of chickens on Timberwolves owner Glenn Taylor's farms. And so this had been a recurring issue for the Timberwolves in the last couple of weeks of the season, then leading into the playoffs. So, there had been other protests that had happened during the game. One woman glued her hand to the court, and all trying to make statements against what was happening on Glenn Taylor's farms. Well, in this particular game, a woman was sitting right behind Glenn Taylor, which is right next to the Timberwolves bench, and tried to get out onto the court and have another demonstration. Well, Pierre Felix was sitting right behind Glenn Taylor as well, and was watching her the whole way. And she tried to get out on the floor, and Pierre was on her super quickly. Like, before she even had the second foot on the court, Pierre had tackled her, brought her down, and subdued her, and kind of let the game go on. So when that happened, I really did want to kind of figure out a little bit more, tell people a little bit more about this person who was in the media spotlight during the playoffs. And he was very reticent to engage in anything right away, because he was getting inundated with so many different outlets reaching out to him and trying to interview him and make him famous and all these things. And after several months, as everything died down, I finally was able to kind of convince him to sit down and talk to me about his whole story. And what you found out is that he's so much more than just a security guard for the team. He grew up in Chicago. His family had a very difficult life down there. They moved to Minneapolis. Um, and he and his friends would sneak into Target Center when they were young and watch games, and they'd get chased around by the security guards and tried to, kind of kick them back out of there. And one night, they got caught again, um, and the head of security at that time for the Timberwolves is named Bob Getters, who still is on staff with the Timberwolves, comes in, and Pierre thinks they're cooked. They're going to jail. They're going to get kind of railroaded here. And Bob Getters looked at him and his friends and said, hey, and handed him some tickets and said, here, if you want to come to the game, don't sneak into the game, just call me and I'll get you tickets to the game. And they were shocked by just the gesture on Bob Getter's part. And so they came to games regularly then for the next couple of years. And then Pierre eventually was hired on as security at Target Center, then hired on again as security with the Timberwolves, and has been there for a very long time now, I think almost 20 years. And so just an incredible story, not just of the moment and the act itself, but certainly also of all of the little things that happened to lead him up to being in that position in the first place.
I think what's interesting about the story, it's two things. One, you did it well after the event had died down and left the news cycle, and then brought so much depth that it made it make sense. But also that the story isn't really about that moment. It's about, like you said, everything that led up to that moment. And I think a lot of people will look at it as wanting to write about like the security protocols and the protests and all that stuff. But you're like, you know what, this person did something interesting. Let's just find out everything about this person, especially because they were such a random and anonymous person to step into like the national spotlight. So I guess, why did you want to do the story the way you did it, where it's really a deep dive into his what turned out to be a really fascinating story and almost ironic story, considering he was the one sneaking in and breaking the rules, and then he went from being, it's like Frank Abagnale from Catch Me If You
Yes.
Can, where he went from being a con artist to helping the FBI find con artists, that kind of thing. So why did you want to do it this way? And then how long did you have to wait to put it together? And then when you finally got a chance to, so far down the road, did it change the way you wanted to tell the story?
Yeah, I would say, like, for those who are kind of familiar with how I do things, I always kind of joke, but I write long form Hallmark cards. Like, that's my favorite thing to do. Like, I like emotion, I like family, I like those things. I'm not on Synergy Sports, like, breaking down, pick and roll coverages and things like that as much. I'm
Sounds
just
like me.
that's not my strength, and that's your strength, and that so many others are great at it. That's just not me. Like, I want to I try to find ways for my goal, especially with a story like this, is like, I want it to appeal not just to Timberwolves basketball fans, not just to NBA basketball fans. I want it to appeal to anyone who just loves a good story. And so, like, what I hope is that, as it gains steam and as people really like dive into the background that he had, getting a gun pulled on him in Chicago and his mother trying to protect him, and moving him out of there, and things of that nature. I want people to look at that and have word of mouth travel, and have some have a grandmother in the suburbs of Minneapolis just say, oh, I don't ever read about sports, but I heard about this story, and I connect with it, and it resonates with me. And so I always try to find those layers, and I always say, like, I want to put the people that you see on your flat screen TV into three dimensions. And so I always wanted to do that. Like, I wanted to really tell his story. Who is this guy, and why did he come through in the moment like that? But then, as the more that I talk to him and others around him, the more unbelievable the story got. Just, going back to, being caught at Target Center and doing those things. Like, now it's a really special story. And now it's a story that I think belongs in the fabric of the organization, not, in the history of the Timberwolves. Like that's kind of a story that really layers up an organization. And so, I initially kind of planned to try and have something done early in the season. But the more I talked to subjects, the more people I wanted to talk to who were coming up in these interviews. And I just realized that there are so many elements to it that I needed to take my time and wait until I absolutely had it all the way surrounded before I put it out there. And then, you know, once I kind of found all of these details and elements, I'm like, this story is going to play no matter if it's in January or if it's right after when he did it or if it's in 2 years from now. And so I became less concerned about the timing of it and more concerned just about doing it justice and writing it the right way. And like, so, we dropped it a week after they played Memphis in January. I was hoping to drop it on the morning of a Memphis Grizzlies game just to have that little bit of a tie to it. Just didn't work out, and we got it ready and unveiled, and I think it did its job.
All right. Well, John did his job. It's a must read. It's called "An NBA Security Guard Went Viral. How He Got to That Moment Is Even More Remarkable." Google it. Go read it. It was one of my favorite stories I read all year. And I mean, I could say that about any John K story, but he's John Krasinski. Andrew Slecht is our producer. That'll do it for us here on the Daily Ding. We will see you next time on the Ding.